I'll record on my computer and then I'll send it to Isabel.
Perfect, thank you.
No worries. How do I there we go. He's in the waiting room, I'll let them in. Okay. Good morning, everybody. We are going to talk about, the grains that were used in period for bread making. We're going to do some history behind that. We're going to talk about some of the logistics and concerns. We're going to try to spread out into some areas around, adjacent to our focus area. And we're going to talk a little bit about baking techniques that you can use for, if you want to make bread in camp at a war, how can we do that without construction? All right, so my name is Mathurin Carbousseau. My passion is archaeoagriculture and bread making. What they had for bread. Bread is and always has been an important staple in diet. For the vast majority of people in England, grain was the bulk of their caloric intake. In other words, what they ate to keep going every day was largely grain. The estimates that I have seen for a 14th century had up to 80% of a harvest worker's calories and 78% of a soldier's caloric intake was grain. And even among the lay nobility of medieval England, that went to 65 to 70%. And just for balance, according to the Mayo Clinic, you get somewhere between 45 and 65% of your calories from carbohydrates of all sorts. So for most people, it was much higher than what we take in. Our focus group, our focus area is going to be, this area in England. Like I said, we're going to go a little bit outside, but the further afield we get from this area, the fewer resources I have, the fewer resources I have to refer to. So this area is London and the counties immediately around London that fed the city. They sent all their produce and their grains and whatever. Almost all of it got shipped into London one way or another. And which way it was done is going to affect what grains are grown where and what grains get left in the countryside and what grains go to London because of shipping costs. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So the Neolithic founder crops, in other words, the crops that were grown in the Fertile Crescent, the first grains that human beings cultivated. They cultivated emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley. The pulses were lentils, peas, chickpeas, and bitter vetch. Don't ask me what bitter vetch is. I've never figured that one out. And the final thing that they grew was flax. And they grew it not just for fiber, but they grew it for food. The flax seeds represented a major part of their fat intake. So over the centuries, as agriculture spread out from the Middle East, the cereals, the crops that were grown became they varied, they differed. For example, you'll see we had wheat and barley in the early days. We don't have oats. We don't have rye. The theory is that oats, we know that they were wild in that area, that they grew wild in that area. And the theory is that as they migrated, as people cultivated, that rye and oats started to mimic Oats started to mimic barley. Rye started to mimic wheat. So they would stand out in the middle of a wheat field going, see, I'm a wheat stalk. Don't cut me down, mister. And eventually they became embedded in the crops that were grown. And as it moved through, expanding into Europe, different soils, climate conditions, etc., meant that some of them came to the fore. For example, you're going to see a lot more rye in in Central and Eastern Europe, and you're going to see a lot more oats in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Scotland, etc., like that. They never supplant the other crops completely, but they can become the major thing and basically become more important than wheat or barley. So at the focus group, we've got trivet wheat, we've got common wheat, we've got rye, we've got maslin or man corn. Maslin is a combination of rye and wheat grown in the same field, harvested together and processed as the same crop processed as one grain. And we'll talk about the reasons for that later. Barley, oats, dredge, and bullmong. Dredge and bullmong are, dredge I believe is the oats and barley combination that's like maslin. Dredge can also be called man corn. It gets kind of confusing when you look at the names over time. They also grew peas, lentils, chickpeas, and beans. So here's a breakdown of consumption of field crops. And basically it talks about wheat was primarily for bread and ale. Rye was for bread, thatch, and fodder or animal feed. Winter barley was for ale, bread, and fodder. Wow, get some more people coming in. Then the mixed grains were maslin and mixed. These are for the winter crops, maslin and mixtil. And maslin is wheat and rye, as we talked about. That was almost entirely used for bread. That's what its purpose was. Mixtil is wheat and winter barley. That could be used for bread or ale. In the spring, we have the oats, which are used for pottage, fodder, ale, thatch, bread. Spring barley, ale, bread, pottage, fodder. The legumes of beans, peas, and vetches, they were for fodder. They were also used for nitrogen fixing in the soils. And they were used for pottage, bread, occasionally bread, or just eaten as vegetables. The mixed were dredge, which is barley and oats, and that was almost entirely used for making ale or beer. Bullmong was oats, beans, and peas. The beans and peas would have been dried and ground into flour along with the oats. That was also used for fodder or nitrogen fixing. That was also used for pottage. And then there are other mixtures that we won't bother going over that. Oh, wrong way. Here's another list. I didn't have a photocopy of that list, but they talked about using wheat and rye for beer and bread and the other things. So the lists differ depending on the researcher as to what they might be used for. But for our purposes of this discussion, and that's just for this discussion, so I'm going to act like it's absolute, but it's not. And so there are lots of little pockets of research anybody wants to take off on is more than welcome. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about wheat and maslin as the main bread flours. And then we're going to talk about the others as being secondary flours, fodder in the form of horse and hound bread, and also pottage. Pottage for the lower classes pretty much was how they took in grains. It's what they ate. Very little bread as we would think of bread. We don't really have any good recipes for bread until the late 16th century. So we do have, the closest one I was able to locate was the one in Platina. And he talks about using flour from wheat, finely sieved. So he's basically making a white bread, what in England would have been called a wastel or a demain loaf. Put it in a bread pan with warm water. He's saying add a little salt after the manner of the people of Ferrari, which tells me that salt was not standard. This was something that certain groups added to their bread, and he thinks that's how it was best. He talks about using leavening and making sure you don't use too little or too much. And in his case, leavening would have been probably old dough. Leavening in England would largely have been, especially in the manors and the commercial bakeries, would have been barm, beer barm. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about later. He talks about adding it, making not too much, adding not too much because it will take on a sour taste, which in some cases we're looking for, or in modern baking, we look for that in a sourdough bread, right? We want a little bit of that sourdough taste. And if there's not enough in it, it will not bake up right. It will be heavy and unhealthful and not readily digested. The bread should be well baked in an oven and not on the same day. This is what more than anything tells me that this was an old dough leavening. They were giving it 24 hours or so to rise. And you'll notice he talks nothing about working or kneading. I take that as a no-knead recipe, but it's possible there's another explanation. I just don't know yet. Whoop. All right, differences in materials, and we'll talk a little bit more about the differences in how they sieved, for example, and stuff like that. But flours were different qualities depending on where they came from in the country. The differences could be marked from one part of that of our focus area to another. These were all landrace fields, and by landrace, what I mean is they didn't have hybridization. They didn't have they didn't buy grain seed from Monsanto and plant it all and give it all exactly the same fertilizer and weed control and whatever. So what you had was grains that had been growing in that same area under those same conditions for generations and had developed different characteristics according to what the local conditions were. And maybe this is a field because of the economics of the manor, this one gets fertilized with sheep dung, whereas another field over there gets fertilized with cow dung. There's just a lot of differences that could take place in there. And a big one is genetically, fields a few miles apart could have very different genetically different wheat or barley or whatever. The different grains such as wheat, barley, and oats, they act differently. If you have ever tried to make a Maslin loaf, a 50-50 loaf of whole wheat and rye, whole rye flour, it will break your heart. It will not rise the way in modern kitchens we expect things to rise. There were different leavening techniques, and those They didn't have a packet of yeast to take to that they bought at the grocery store. So what was commonly used, especially in England, was beer barm. And that could be there's people wanting to be admitted. So welcome to the new people. Make sure that you clear your, make sure you mute your microphone, please. So if the mixed grains act very differently when you bake them, different sieving of a same grain will have different results. So, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the different leavening techniques were beer barm, which is most common in England. Old dough was most common in the Mediterranean, in that area, and France, where beer wasn't as big a deal, but wine was. But wine yeast doesn't make good bread. And then there was wild yeast. If you make bread every day, you're going to have wild yeast in your kitchen that you can literally put the dough out and let them land on it, and it will start working. It is a slower take, which is why I think Platina's recipe is basically talking about an old dough or a wild yeast leavening. But I think it's old dough because he specifically talks about measuring out the leavening. All right. So here's what we can do, since we don't know combinations of grains. We don't know we know there were mixtures. We don't know what they were. And we know for a fact, for example, just as an example, Maslin. Maslin is grown in one field as one crop and processed that way and ground that way into flour. It is rye and wheat together. Well, depending on that year's growing conditions, it could be more rye or it could be more wheat. So we do not have an exact amount. So you can experiment with these mixtures of grains and see what they produce. I have some examples of folks who have experimented with this stuff that we'll get to. Experiment with sieving. Sieving produces significant differences between breads of the same flour. Slow baking in a cooler oven, and just expect that this is going to be a flatter, darker loaf with a dense crumb and a chewier crust, because that's how they were baking bread. Try different amounts of kneading or no kneading at all, as per Platina. Make unleavened flatbreads. We're talking sisals, hearth cakes. We're talking some of the flatbreads. Flatbreads are all over the world. And they are pretty much the same thing. You make a dough and you flatten it out and you cook it somehow. Whether that's a tandoori or whether that's a hearth cake. Leave out the salt. Again, there's no indication of salt in either the manorial accounts or the assizes, and Platina treats it as a special thing to add, and that's later period. Oop, boom. So there's a couple of different ways that bread was baked. A communal clay oven is pretty typical. That might be in a village. This particular one is from 1564 Fort Caroline. So it was a pioneer fort, a French pioneer fort. But you might find these in any village. In Western Europe, in England and France, you very rarely found ovens in households during the Middle Ages. And there's a reason for that, basically because the manorial estates wanted to have a monopoly on anything to do with bread and grain. So the manor had a communal oven. The manor had a miller. The manor might actually have a baker if it was big enough, but usually it was, here's the oven, you bring your dough, you cook it in the oven. And you get charged a piece for it. Commercial or manorial ovens, these were typically of brick because they were intended to, they were willing to spend more. And they didn't bake once a week, they baked every day. This is a picture from the mid-1200s. As you can see, these are both black ovens. By that I mean they don't have a chimney. The smoke and flame come out the door. And essentially the methodology for using a black oven is you build up a big fire inside and you let it heat up. You get the bricks or the clay or whatever it's constructed of. You get it as hot as you can get it. And once the flames die down, you pull all the ashes and embers out. You scrape them out, you mop them out with a wet mop, and then you put your baking in it and close the door. And the heat that's built up in the oven itself is how it bakes. And as that oven cools, you put different things in it. You put things that need higher temperatures in it first, and you put things that need lower temperatures in next, and so on and so forth, until you get down to the end. And at least in the New World, what they tended to do was put their baked beans in there to cook overnight so they didn't have to cook on the Sabbath the next day. All right. All right. So Mistress Eulalia Piebaker has a website, and she has talked about her experiments with different grains. And at the very top is wastel. Wastel is a relatively finely sieved wheat. It is what the bakers of, it is a category that comes from the sizes of bread and beer, and it is defined as twice sieved, and with two different layers of sieve, two different levels of sieving, one coarser, one finer. So the top one, as you can see, is still quite dark, but it is a sieved wheat. And you can see the crumb is far more open than the other two. The next one down is Maslin, which, as we talked about, is a combination of wheat and rye. And I believe Eulalia's example here, she tried different percentages. This one was a 50-50. It's got a little bit more denser crumb. And then the bottom is a mixed loaf. Okay, sorry. My Amazon came up. The bottom is a mixed loaf. It is a mixture of wheat, rye, I believe it was barley, and pulses, like pea and bean flour. So that's Eulalia, and she did that at a 350-degree oven, just for reference. She actually bought she didn't sieve these herself. She bought them from Lammas Fair, and I will give you guys a link to that later. They grow landrace grains. They actually grow Maslin, and they grow the different combinations. All right. So this is from Richard Fitch. Richard Fitch is a fellow at the Royal Kitchens in England, the Royal Palace Kitchens. And he has done quite a bit of work on trying to duplicate the sieving techniques and the results based on the sizes of bread. And so he did this as an experiment in sieving. On the far left, you see Wastel. This is the one that has been most sieved. On the next one, you see Cribble. That is the one that has a lesser sieving. On the next one over is called Trait, and again, that's just a lesser sieving. And on the far right is just straight bran. In other words, we have sieved the same flour 3 times, and these are the products we got out of it. See, these are loaves that were baked by Mr. Fitch. Left to right again, this is Wastel, Cribble, and Trait. And as you can see again, here we see this Wastel is this gorgeous open crumb with, it's really risen. It's really what we think of as bread. The next one over is the Cribble. The Cribble is the one that was the second sieving. And that, as you can see, is considerably denser crumb, considerably less risen. And the third one, the one on the far right, is Trait. And that was the first sieving. And as you can see, that's way dense. That is way dense. And that's some of the times that I have used less refined grains. This is the kind of result I have gotten. And there's a closer look at the Wastel loaf and at the Cribble loaf and at the Trait loaf. And there's a side-by-side comparison of the Wastel and Cribble. And let's see what else I have missed. So when we talk about the differences in the grains that were used, there's difference that we talked about climate and soil making a big difference on what grains get used, what grains get grown, and thus what gets chosen for bread. There's also logistics. The 10 Feed the City counties that we're talking about in our focus area, and similar areas around other large towns, they ship mostly wheat. And the reason for that is because it has a high caloric density. It has higher food value over other grains. And shipping the cheaper grains was prohibitive in cost of cartage. So what you get is the estates further out from London, so let's say in Oxfordshire, they tend to ship only wheat because they have to at least get it carted to river portage and get it river shipping to get it to the city. And the cost of actually moving it is very high. So they just concentrated on wheat by and large. Estates that were closer to the city or closer to good river shipping would ship other things. We see rye, maslin, barley, and oats produced for market and sent in and shipped to London, as well as wheat. We just don't see them in as high quantities. And they are mostly coming from places where it's cheaper to ship from. One of the reasons we're looking at this area of, aside from the fact I found tons of resources for it, the area around London in the 1250 to 1350s, because we don't have We don't have any civil wars. We don't have any wars of secession. We don't have any of the kinds of internal conflicts that can cause a change in, like disrupt crops and such. We also, we have right in the middle of that period, we have two mass mortality events. We have the Great Famine and we have the Black Death. And that completely changes the demand for grains. And it makes, it changes the economic status of the people who are left alive. And so we get this huge change to where we compare the first half to the second half. And we can see what grains were grown because they were the best or because they were cheap or whatever, and what grains were grown because people really like them. That's why after 1350, we start seeing wheat flour supplanting all the other flours, not completely eliminating them, but supplanting them in popularity. The 13th century also shows the peak of centrally managed manorial estates. In other words, I am the lord of the manor and everybody works for me, and I tell everybody you're going to grow that, and you're going to grow that, and there you're going to grow that, and this is when you're going to, probably not me, probably a supervisory personnel that work for me. But it's a corporation, it's a corporate agriculture. After 1350, that starts to go away. And the intensive cropping and crop rotations that were taking place, because in the first half, we're talking about an England that is essentially, for all intents and purposes, overpopulated as far as their agricultural capacity. They were right on the edge. And that's why in the Great Famine, killed a lot of people, because there wasn't a surplus productivity. And then along came the Black Death, which probably was helped along by the Great Famine. Excuse me. So we end up with England after 1350 with a population it will not achieve the pre 1350 population until the 1700s. That's how much change occurred because of that. So we get that. We get, because of that, we get a huge change in land use and crop demand. We also see a change with a transition from the centrally managed manorial estates to tenant farmers and even yeoman farmers. A yeoman farmer owns his own land. So that changes what crops get sent. And again, so I'm a small farmer now. I'm no longer working for a lord. I'm either a tenant farmer who has to pay rent but doesn't have to answer to any other way, or I'm a yeoman farmer and I don't have to answer to anybody except make sure I get my family fed. So for the smaller farmers, it was even more important to be producing the highest demand, the highest yield, and that was wheat. And it tended to drive out the others. Again, not completely. They've always been around and they always will be around, but they were, their status, their place in the socioeconomic sphere starts to disappear. We get wheat bread at lower class tables. And we get wastel level wheat bread at lower class tables. The sizes in bread of beer, which I have talked about before, they are a nationwide standard for bakers. They determined how the bread was to be sieved in order to be called wastel or trait. They had the loaves had to weigh so much. They had to produce penny loaves, and those penny loaves were based on the cost of grain. So if wheat is expensive, then our penny loaf is going to go smaller. But they still have to make a loaf that they sell for a penny. The penny loaf could be smaller if the grain is more expensive, or it could be bigger if the grain is less expensive. The weight of that bread was directly tied to the market price of grain. So a baker can't make a teeny tiny little penny loaf when wheat is cheap. They had their pricing had to be set based on the cost of grain. As far as our experimental approach, let's see how far I got that with that. Let's talk about breaking. We'll talk about baking bread without an oven in a minute. Let's go back to talking about what we can do as experimental bakers. As I said, we were going to experiment with sieving. We're going to concentrate on wheat, rye, and barley and mixtures of those grains. We're going to bake slow in a cooler oven. And we're going to try different amounts of kneading or no kneading. We're going to maybe not put salt in, maybe do put salt in. We can do, excuse me, different sources suggest a different level of moisture in the dough. Campbell says a water ratio of 78% to 22%. Fitch says that the closest he has gotten is 70-30. By closest, that means it was as dry as he could get and it'd still be workable. And he says a more practical ratio is 66 to 33%. So 2/3, 1/3. And this gets back to the absorption rate of medieval and modern flours, right? So medieval flours, as we've talked about, were different from modern flours in many ways. Sometimes sieving, but a lot of times it was the actual nature of the wheat or rye or barley that was grown in those landrace fields. They could have different absorption rates. They were typically oilier than what we get at the grocery store. So they didn't absorb as much water, and they tended to go with a drier dough. The sizes of bread and beer don't specify the weight of the flour, only the minimum weight of final loaves. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, now I know all of this. And I've done my own research and I've decided I'm going to make a Maslin loaf that is 30% rye and 70% wheat. And I'm going to make it without salt, and I'm going to make it in a 2/3, 1/3 ratio flour, water to flour, and I'm going to I'm going to use an old dough leavening, or I'm going to use a beer barm leavening. I happen to have a buddy who's a brewer. So I got some beer barm, and I'm going to make the loaf, and I'm going to let it set for 24 hours rising. And I want to do this. I want to do this at an event, at a war, in camp, and I do not have the wherewithal to construct a bread oven. How can I do this? Well, we do know sisals, and don't ask me if that pronunciation is correct. They're also hearth cakes. They're basic flatbreads, universally across the world, right? So how do we make sisals in camp? Well, we take the bread, we take the dough, we don't leaven it, or we don't leaven it much. We don't give it a lot of time to rise, even if we do. So we pat them into a flat disc and we lay them on the coals of the fire. We watch for them to brown around the underside edge, and then we flip them over and cook them for the same amount of time on the other side, and then we remove them. We eat them warm with a young cheese, with butter, or with bacon, or even with bacon grease. And this is going to be for most people throughout most of medieval period, this is going to be what bread is. If you are a peasant in the intense manorial agricultural period, this is what when you're not eating pottage, this is what you're going to have as your grain intake. And if you're lucky and it's the right time of year, you will have butter, or you will have lard, or you will have cheese. If you're not lucky and it's the not right time of year, you'll be eating them dry. Or you won't be eating these, you will be eating pottage. As you work up the socioeconomic ladder, let's say you're an estate supervisor of some sort, you're going to eat this most of the time. You're going to have some Maslin bread other times, special times, weekends, whatever, feast days. And once a year, everybody on the estate is going to get what's called boon bread, which is typically Maslin, but can be some of the more cheapskate manorial lords would try to get away with cheaper breads. But most of the time it was Maslin for most of the estates. So that is a really easy way. Fry up some bacon, fry up some sisals. There you go. You've done your breakfast. And you've cooked a period bread in a period way in camp. The next step up is pot or kettle bread. And this one's kind of hard to get your arms around. We know that we have mostly survivals in Wales and in the areas of England adjacent to Wales, and in Ireland. And again, you would have to be a fairly wealthy peasant to have a pot, because what we think of as a camp kettle or a camp Dutch oven, that cast iron technique was post-period. The ability to make cast iron in those quantities as utensils, cheap enough to be utensils, was post-period, it was 1600s. And what we know today, when we go out and we buy a Lodge camp oven, all of the elements of that put together, the rimmed lid, the legs, that's all 18th century. The different elements were all there, but put together the way we think of it now, they weren't there. So what you had was things like this, a Roman klibanus, which is a clay container. Some of them have that rim around the top. Some of them don't. Some of them are bell-shaped, and as you can see, they don't have the rim around the top. The coals are piled up on this against their sides. These are used by Roman reenactors we know. We see them from Roman ruins, especially Pompeii. So we know that technique was in use then. Now, was it used in period? Don't know. What we do know is that period pots often have lips that could well have been used to hold coals on top, which is important for baking, to have heat on top as well as on the bottom. We know that in period, folks who had a little bit higher than the dirt poor peasants had riveted iron pots. Further up the chain, they might have cast bronze pots, which again might have a flat or a dished lid. But we can't really say at this point that bread was baked in a pot during period. There are a lot of reasons that it may not have been, because the manorial estates, again, as I said, wanted a monopoly on everything to do with bread and grain. So it may have been something you did on the down low if you did it at all. And if you're doing it on the down low, you're probably doing hearth cakes. Again, these camp ovens or Dutch ovens. They are purely 17th, 18th century North American invention. All the elements, of course, you can find in other earlier examples, but to put it all together with that lovely rimmed lid and the legs and the bail, that's something that developed in the New World. I do want to show you can I get this to quit? Yeah, there we go. Lammas Fair Flowers by a gentleman in England named John Letts. And he makes, they're all out of stock now, and we probably won't be back in stock until harvest time. But he makes various blends of traditional flowers. He makes something that he calls Anglo-Saxon light rye or wholemeal rye. He makes something that he calls a Norman blend of rivet wheat. He makes Maslin wheat and rye. And he does this in more or less traditional manner. So these are all landrace fields that he's growing. And so these are as close as we're going to get to medieval flowers. If you want to experiment more with what we consider what would be closer to a medieval flower to work with. That's basically all I've got. Is there anybody who has any questions? Please do not hesitate to speak up.
Matherin, I don't have a question, but when you were speaking about bitter vetch before, it took a second, and I was able to find out a little bit of information about bitter vetch.
Okay.
It's also called a health pea. It's from the pea family. It's considered a perennial herb. And I did put a link in the messages.
Okay.
I have to type it out since I'm doing it on the other computer. But I did by doing a search, just basically what is bitter vetch.
Okay.
And I'm trying to get back to that so I can tell you which. And it was the one I used was it's luontoporti.com. But they have a picture of the plant and everything that goes along with it.
Cool.
Also, a lot of looks like there was also a weight loss site that was saying that it may have helped to curb appetite.
Okay.
But that's all I could find on that. So.
All right.
Dings.
Yeah. So I need to get back to the chat part. It's in tight. I was going to share some of these links and stuff, but I'm gonna send this my notes, which include links to the sources. It'll also include a link to my Google Drive that has all these sources, or at least most of them, and also has the class notes and the slides, and that'll be available on the website when.
There's also a website just called bittervetch.com that is advertising that you can purchase seeds to grow your own bitter vetch.
Ooh. Okay. Does anybody else has any questions, comments? Matherin, you're an idiot. You forgot this.
So Matherin, was there a predetermined price of shipping of grains for like different things? Like was wheat more expensive to ship than barley or anything like that?
No. Cartage and river shipping were based on tonnage, which is why wheat was often the only thing that they could make money on by shipping it. Cartage with horses was very expensive per mile, and river cartage was pretty cheap per mile, and those prices could of course vary, just like any other market price. So that's why you get the local, or the ones right on the river, being able to ship more of the mixed grains and more of the rye and barley and such, because they still had to get there. There were still beer makers in London. who still needed those grains. It's just that the farther afield you were from a river system, from a river of navigable river, the more expensive it was to ship.
Mathern, there is a question on the chat side. It says, we see millet recipes in the 15th century England.
Mhm.
It's not on your list. Does millet figure into your research?
The research, the stuff that I was getting a hold of, the resources, were concentrating on what was coming out of the factory farm manorial estates. And some of the grains we know existed, such as millet, did not make that cut. We're not a significant enough part of that process. Now, what was being happening out in the countryside, what was being happening outside of the 10 counties, I don't have any numbers for that. Just like I don't have any, we know trivet wheat, we know emmer wheat and einkorn wheat continue to be grown throughout period. They just weren't significant in that area.
There is also a question about hearthstones. How common are hearthstones to cook hearth cakes on? The medieval hearths that I've seen don't all have hearthstones.
No, they don't. That's why they were baked. That's why I don't want to say as authoritative voice here. I want to say what most researchers suggest, what the archaeology shows, is that these were baked on the coals rather than on a flat stone. Now we do know that, like you said, some places it was far more common to have hearthstones. In which case, again, you start talking about the same processes as the black ovens. You get you heat up the stone with the fire, and then as it dies down, then you use the heat from the stone to bake. But when you don't have that tool, you use the coals, the embers of the fire. Somehow I'm not getting to the chat window. I don't know why, but
that's okay. Did they use any other types of nut flours like almond flour?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we know that they were using, we know anecdotally that they were using things like acorns and walnuts and stuff like that. We do know that. We know that they turned them into flour. We do know that when we talk about pottage, we're talking about whatever grain they had plus whatever else they could throw in the pot. Okay. So a pottage would have vegetables. It might, if they had a little bit of meat, such as bacon, which is not uncommon even for the lower classes. They wouldn't have much. They would have some, and they would throw that into the pottage as well. Pottage was basically whatever you threw in the pot, but it usually had a grain base. So yeah, they would have used nut flour in that as well. I just don't have any examples. I don't have any research that shows me they used nut flour in baking. But in those lesser breads, when we're talking about horse bread and hound bread, when we're talking about when we're talking about some of those lesser breads that are just slightly better than pottage, I have no doubt that there was nut flour in there.
Another question. Someone would like the gentleman's name again that sells the landrace grains.
That gentleman's name is. Okay, the gentleman's name is John Letts. That's Letts. But he sells through a company called bakerybits.co.uk. And the name of his products is Llamasphere, Lammasfayre. And if you Google Llamasphere, you're going to get right straight to the Llamasphere page on Bakery Bits.
There was a mention of boiled bread as well, and using Roman baked the ovens that the Romans used.
Right.
Someone mentioned that vetch is commonly used as a ground coverage on highways.
Yeah. It just get in the resources I have. It just gets lumped in with all the other pulses, the beans, the peas,
Yeah.
lentils, and stuff. So it
There
obviously has food qualities that we don't typically think of in the modern world.
Someone mentioned that grape yeast is very good for bread, but they've never tried wine. The wine can't. Yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yes, the wine lees.
Yeast.
Yeah, and that may well be the case. What we do know, however, is that they were using. They may have used grape yeast, but they would have used it to make. I hesitate to use the term sourdough because that's a very specific thing that. But old dough, they would use it to make up a dough, and then they would hold some of that dough back, and then they would take that old dough and they would let it dry out. And then when they were ready to bake again, they would crumble that that ball of old dough, and they would use they would add that to their new batch, and then they'd do the same thing. They would take from that batch of dough they made, they would take it out. So the starter, if you will, could very easily have been grape yeast or any other sort, or wild yeast or any other format that would have to get it somewhere. But in France and in around the Mediterranean, it's Italy and stuff like that. They really didn't have a big. First of all, they didn't have a big brewing culture, and they didn't have the guild structure. In England, the guild structure was like, okay, you want to be a baker, then you're going to buy your barm from the Brewers Guild. No, that wasn't a suggestion. You will. The guild structure in England was very tight, probably tighter than any other guild groups in anywhere other than Italy.
There is another question about the shipping price for grains. Was there a predetermined shipping price for different grains? And when recreating the loaves, should we assume that 3/4 of a pound of flour is about a penny loaf?
I would say, well, there's two parts to that question, and somebody else had asked it already. But as far as the shipping part, the shipping is going to is by tonnage, right? They're not going to charge. Well, I don't want to say never. They're going to charge by the tonnage. They're going to say this much of whatever cargo you have is going to cost you this much, and that cost is going to be subject to market forces just like any other price. It won't be different. I don't want to say it won't be different, because I'm sure there were shippers who said, Mr. Estate Manager, you have to get wheat to London. Shame if that rotted on the shore. Let's see. I can do that for you for twice the normal price. So I'm sure there was that kind of stuff going on, but by and large, it was just tonnage. And let's see, what was the second part of that?
Were there set costs for shipping of
Yeah.
the grain?
There were no set costs. The costs went along with the market, but there was another part of that question, wasn't there? Or a second question? It was after the one about shipping.
I think you got them both, actually.
Okay.
There's more about vetches. Somebody posted that vetches are poisonous, so please experiment with care, and that vetch contamination in red lentils would cause to dump the whole load of red lentils.
Okay, good to know. So they obviously processed bitter vetch in a way other than just pick it and throw it in the bread.
And then another question, were grains such as cassava, amaranth, and spelt used in period?
Yes. Not so much in the subject area that we're looking at, the 10 counties around London, but they were used in other areas. I do not know what their preeminence was in other areas. What I am aware of is that in areas like Central and Eastern Europe, rye basically flip-flopped with wheat, as rye being more important in the agriculture than wheat. They were both there. They were just in different percentages. And the same with oats in the north. So we know spelt is around. We know spelt has been around forever, right? But how much did it matter?
For anyone that's interested, there's a link in the chat section called Historical Italian Cooking that shows how to use grape must as a leavening for bread. And it's a YouTube channel. So.
Okay.
And I believe I've caught all the questions that were in the chat.
Okay.
If I missed anything or anybody has any one thing to add, I'm going to be quiet now.
Okay. I can't see the chat session, so if you want to ask a question, please unmute and just ask it.
Well, how about if I unmute and say thank you very much?
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for the class and for answering the questions.
Thank you. Well, at this point, I'm going to give, if I can, figure out how to give the hosting thing back to Her Excellency. No, that's not what I want. I mean, your help, Your Excellency, to give you back the hosting. Sorry?
Then you go to participants, and then you click on me over on the far right-hand side, I believe.
There we
And
go.
then we'll give you options.
All right. That should have you back.
Yay, it says I'm the host again.
Yay.
Thank you. I'll always learn something new every time I listen. There's more and more and more. Whether it's just didn't stick in my brain before or what.
Well, I'm constantly adding to it. I just got my hands on a paper from the people who did the Feeding the City research on fueling the city and how they got wood and charcoal and stuff. So that's something I just haven't actually got my teeth into yet, but yeah.
Well, if there's anybody else that has any questions, I guess it would be now's the time to ask away or contact us at a later date. If not, I'm going to go ahead and close the room.
right. Thank you.
I'll probably see some of you in a class here a little bit later. Bye.
Bye. Now.